So we have already discussed sentence structure and clauses. We talked about independent clauses and dependent clauses. The type of dependent clause that we talked about was adverb clauses. So now we're going to talk about a different type of dependent clause, adjective clauses. Remember what you know about dependent clauses. They cannot be a sentence on their own. So if I have an adjective clause, that means I have to connect it to another independent clause. What's a little bit different about adjective clauses is their position in a sentence. Sometimes it can come in the middle of the sentence, sometimes at the end. It just really depends on where you have nouns in the sentence. Anywhere you have a noun in the sentence, you can have an adjective clause. So adjective clauses, also known as relative clauses, allow you to add extra information. They give you extra information about a noun, just like an adjective is a word that modifies a noun or describes a noun. An adjective clause functions in the same way. It's instead of being just one word or a phrase, though, it's a clause which has a subject and a verb. There are two types of adjective clauses. One is restrictive and one is non-restrictive. So let's talk about each of those different types. Let's first talk about restrictive adjective clauses. So think about that word restrict. Restrict means to limit something or limit the possibilities or stop someone from doing something or just to kind of keep things under control. And an adjective clause, a restrictive adjective clause, does kind of the same thing. So it provides information that is necessary to identify the antecedent. Antecedent is just a fancy word for the noun that comes before. So the noun that we're modifying is the antecedent. The noun that we're describing is the antecedent. And the adjective clause gives you information that you need in order to know who or what that noun is. So it narrows the meaning, or it limits or restricts the possibilities of who or what that noun could be. So think about it this way. We use restrictive adjective clauses to modify very general nouns. If I say woman or teacher, school, hospital, you have no idea. There's many teachers and schools and hospitals in the world. Without any extra information, there's limitless possibilities of who or what that noun could be. So you need the adjective clause to limit the possibilities of who or what that general noun could be. Don't use a comma with restrictive adjective clauses. We do use a special kind of connecting word, so different than adverb clauses where we use a subordinating conjunction. In adjective clauses, we use something called a relative pronoun. Now, depending on the type of clause, because just like independent clauses, dependent clauses can also have a subject and a verb and an object. And so the relative pronoun in restrictive adjective clauses can do all of those different jobs. It can be the subject of the adjective clause, or it can be the object of the adjective clause. It can also function as a possessive in the adjective clause. It also makes a difference whether the noun that we're modifying, remember that word antecedent, the noun that we're modifying, is it human or is it non-human? So all of those things will tell you what is the appropriate relative pronoun to use in the restrictive clause. If it's the subject of the clause and it's a human, we use who as our connecting word. You can also use that, but it's very informal to use that for a person. If it's not a person, we use that as our connecting word. You can also use which, but that is not acceptable in writing. If you're writing, you should be using the relative pronoun that for relative clauses. However, you will see which used in speaking. If your relative pronoun is the object of the clause, you're going to use whom. But you'll also hear who and that used, especially in informal or spoken English. For an object function, it's also that as your relative pronoun. And then if it's possessive, whether it's human or non-human, you're going to use the relative pronoun whose. And then one last thing, if the noun that you're modifying is a place or a time, you can use where or when as your relative pronouns. For example, I could say Oakton College, where I take classes, is a friendly environment. Or 2016, when the Cubs won the World Series, was a great year. So if I'm modifying a place or a time, I can use where or when as my relative pronoun. Let's take a look at some examples. So first, let's look at an example where the relative pronoun is going to be the subject of the clause. So I've got two sentences here. The woman is a teacher and she lives next door to me. In these two independent clauses, there is a noun that is the same. So in the first clause, it's woman, and then in the second clause, it's the pronoun she. Now, to make a more advanced sentence, I can combine those two using an adjective clause. And I can take that second clause, she lives next door to me, and turn it into an adjective clause. So the first thing I have to do is I have to decide, am I going to use a subject, an object, or a possessive relative pronoun? Well, she is the subject of the clause, so I'm going to use a subject pronoun. And so, right, she refers to the woman, so I can connect those two clauses together. If it's the subject of the clause and woman is a person, that means that I'm going to use the relative pronoun who. So who is going to become the subject of my adjective clause. Now I'm going to put the two sentences together. I start with the noun that I'm modifying, so the woman. And then something that's really important to keep in mind is that your relative pronoun, who, whom, whose, that, which, the relative pronoun always goes next to the noun that you're modifying. In this case, that's really easy to do because our relative pronoun is the subject of the clause, so it's already at the beginning of the sentence. So that means I just move that whole clause, the woman who lives next door to me, that all goes next to the noun that I'm modifying. And then I finish my independent clause, so the verb and the rest of the sentence of my independent clause comes next. I do not use a comma because woman, if I take everything else away, woman is a general noun, and so that means this is a restrictive adjective clause. All right, let's look at an example where the relative pronoun is the object of the clause. So again, I've got two independent clauses and I want to combine them. So I've got the thieves were trying to sell the watch and the police arrested them. Let's take that second adjective clause and let's take that second independent clause and make that one our adjective clause. The police arrested them. So in this case, I've got thieves and them, okay? In the second clause, them is the object, and it's referring to thieves. So remember our chart from before. If it's the object and it's a person, I'm going to replace that with whom. Now, as we begin to build our complex sentence here with our adjective clause, remember what I said before. The relative pronoun always has to go next to the noun that it's modifying. But in our example, the police arrested whom. Whom comes at the end of the clause instead of the beginning. So that means that I have to move the object. objects normally come after verbs in regular sentence order. But in this case, in order to make sure that that relative pronoun is next to the noun thieves, I have to move it to the beginning of the clause. And then I follow that with the rest of the sentence. The thieves, whom the police arrested, and then I finish my independent clause, were trying to sell the watch. Be careful. Don't add a pronoun object if the relative pronoun is already the object of the adjective clause. So don't do something like this. The thieves, whom the police arrested them, were trying to sell the watch. I don't need them because whom is already my object of the adjective clause. So whom the police arrested, that's my adjective clause. Police is the subject of that adjective clause. It's the subject of the verb arrested, and whom is the object of the verb arrested. Even though it's coming before the subject, it is still the object of the clause. Let's do one more example of restrictive adjective clauses. Let's do an example with a possessive. So in this case, again, I've got two independent clauses. They climbed a mountain. Its peak was covered in ice. In this case, its is a possessive adjective. It's a possessive for the noun peak, and it refers to mountain. So if what I'm trying to make into my adjective clause is a possessive, I'm going to replace that with the relative pronoun whose. And then I put everything together. They climbed a mountain. Now in this case, my noun is at the end of my independent clause. So my whole independent clause comes first, then my relative pronoun goes next to that noun I'm modifying, and then I finish with the rest of the adjective clause. Okay, let's talk about non-restrictive adjective clauses. So remember, with restrictive clauses, we said that it's a general noun where there's a lot of possibilities and we need that information in order to restrict or define who or what that noun could be. Well, in the case of non-restrictive adjective clauses, we're giving additional non-essential information. What that means is we don't need the information in order to know who or what that noun could be. The information is just extra. And what that tells us is that the nouns that are serving as our antecedents are usually a proper noun. Think capital letters, names of people, places, things, or a unique common noun. In this case, you do use a comma to separate the non-restrictive adjective clause from the rest of the sentence. Our chart of relative pronouns looks very much the same, so you'll see that for humans, who, whom, and whose, those are all the same. The only difference comes with subject and object non-human relative pronouns. Instead of using that, we use which. So let's take a look at an example. In this case, I've got, again, two independent clauses. Her computer has crashed. She bought it only last week. Let's make the second clause our adjective clause. So here I've got it, which is the object of the sentence. It is referring to her computer. In this case, computer is her computer is a unique common noun because most people only use one computer, so we can logically assume that her computer is the only one that she has. Therefore, the noun is not general, it's specific. So since it's specific, that means I'm using a non-restrictive adjective clause. And if I have an object, non-human, I'm going to replace that with which. So now I get something that looks like this. Her computer. Remember that relative pronoun, it moves to the front of the adjective clause so that it can be next to the noun it's modifying. Her computer, which she bought only last week. And then I finish the independent clause with has crashed. Now, remember that because this is a non-restrictive adjective clause, bam, I use commas. If you have any questions, we can talk about those in class next week. You have an assignment to do, and there'll be some additional practice that you can look at with adjective clauses.